Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I appreciate you making out through the rain and whatnot. My name is Nicholas Schmidl. I'm a fellow here at the New America Foundation and the author of To Live or to Perish Forever, a book that I wrote last year about a couple of years living in Pakistan. So this is actually a fantastic book event today because I've spent a lot of time in controversial and pivotal mosques in South Asia. Ian Johnson, who has just written a book today, or has just written a book that we're going to be talking about today called A Mosque in Munich, subtitled Nazis, the CIA, and the Rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West, has written a book, obviously, about a mosque in Europe. So I think this will be a fantastic opportunity to talk about the foothold that the Muslim Brotherhood and the global reach of the Muslim Brotherhood and what that means both for U.S. policy and for sort of the evolution of how they got there. Ian is a former Wall Street Journal reporter of 13 years, is currently based in Beijing, Pulitzer Prize winner, author of a book about China, Wild Grass, 3 Stories of Change in Modern China, and has been working on this book for 8 years? Forever. So we'll just say, we'll go with that. And so what we're going to do today is keep it very informal. Ian and I'll let Ian talk a little bit about the book, and then we'll turn it over to question and answer and an open discussion here, after a few minutes. If you're dying to ask a question sometime early while Ian's talking, if you wave wildly, we'll probably acknowledge your question as well. So I guess we'll just start, Ian, with, if you could talk about how the book came about. I mean, from what I understand, a lot of books are born out of bookstores. You're energized and you see a book and you think, I want to write that book. But yours is a little like that, but a little different.
Yeah, the book was the result of a couple of things. The immediate impetus was I saw a map of the world that had, in an Islamic bookstore in London, and it had, on the edge of it, it had famous mosques of the world, and it had some of the better known mosques in the world, but it also had the Islamic Center of Munich on there, and I kind of wondered, what was this mosque doing here? It was like the Sesame Street, one of these things don't belong, it doesn't belong with the other or whatever, reaching back to my childhood. And I began to look into this mosque a little more carefully, and I realized that in the religion of Islam, this mosque is not important. But in the history of political Islam, the Islamic Center of Munich is really important. And this was indeed an Islamist bookstore that I was in, and that's why this map had the mosque, included the mosque. So,
and had you ever heard of this mosque before then?
Well, there are several Muslim organizations in Germany. One is the Islamic Community of Germany, and its headquarters was at that mosque. So I had an idea that it was important, but this Islamic Community of Germany wasn't the largest by any means in Germany, and so I couldn't really quite figure it out. But by looking in public records, which led me to archives, and then, of course, interviews with people, I began to reconstruct the history.
And so, I mean, I guess we could probably talk about the book based on its 3 subtitles. I guess first, what was the relationship between this mosque or the folks associated with this mosque with the Nazis?
Yeah, well, the subtitle is in 3 parts, and I think these are the 3 phases that this mosque's history straddles. And there are also, I think, 3 efforts to use Islam, to instrumentalize Islam for political purposes. The people who were involved in founding the mosque, many of them had fought for the Germans in World War II, and there was a very influential German academic, Gerhard von Mende, who had set up this program for the Nazis to make use of Muslim POWs in propaganda operations against the Soviets. Von Mende resurfaced after the war, and many of the people who had worked for him, many of the Muslims who had worked for him, also ended up in Munich after the war, and it was the idea of von Mende and the people around him to build this mosque as a way to bind these Muslims closely to the West German state.
And how many mosques in sort of in Germany coming out of World War II were there?
Well, that's the interesting thing. There were basically just 2 or 3. There was one in Hamburg for Persian, Iranian traders, Hamburg being a big port city, etc. There was one in Berlin, and basically that was it. So this one being built was quite unusual for that time, 1950s post-war Germany.
Now, you mentioned that in Hamburg that there was a large number of Persians there, or that it was built for Persians. Obviously, the influx of Muslim immigration in Europe hadn't happened yet, but did you still see certain communities, ethnic communities, Muslim communities migrating in specific areas? I mean, Germany is often associated with a large Turkish population today. Had Turks started arriving in numbers, or who was the majority of the Muslim minorities at the time?
Yeah, that basically hadn't happened. There were very, very few Muslims in post-war Germany, probably just in the thousands, and probably the largest single group were the Muslims left over from World War II who were in Munich. They were primarily Turkic from the Soviet Union, modern-day Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, but they were not yet, the Turks hadn't yet really arrived. They were starting to come later in the 1960s.
And so how do we phase out from Nazis to CIA?
Right. Well, von Mende's program was taken over lock, stock, and barrel by the CIA, by one of the largest covert propaganda operations of the early Cold War, called AMCOM-Lib, American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism. So you get AMCOM-Lib. And they took this over, and the second big figure in the book is the CIA agent, Robert Dreher. Bob Dreher was a really improbable person to work with, people of any sort of faith, because he was a sort of happy-go-lucky nudist colony frequenting guy who, in his letters back home, his biggest concern was what was the right piece of stereo equipment to buy, or whether you should buy a VW or a blah, 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 and all these sort of superficial questions. But he was an ardent Cold Warrior, and subscribed to the idea of rollback, not just containing communism, but really rolling it back. And he saw in the Muslims in Munich an opportunity to do that. So you get like the second effort to use Islam.
Well, let's talk about Dreher for a second, because as you mentioned, I mean, here is the guy who's running the largest covert propaganda campaign of the early Cold War, and he's a nudist. I mean, what were some of the anecdotes here that I mean, well, he shows up naked in a lot of weird places, right?
Not in the office, but he used to, when he made one trip back to Europe, it was like, well, I have to make it to the Ile de Levant off France so I can go to spend my nudist vacation there. Goes back to Munich afterwards, and it's taking a lot of pictures and puts them on his desk. And the people, the emigres he was working with, many of them conservative, whether Muslim or not, come in and look at this and are just like shocked, like what's going on here? So Dreher was, as one guy wrote me an email a couple days ago who had worked there. He said, I always thought Bob Dreher was a blithering idiot, but I didn't realize he was involved in something serious at the time. So maybe he was really like get smart or something.
Now the emigres, if we could talk a little bit about them, who they were, and I mean, were they? One of the things that I picked up from the book, I mean, it seems like they were almost just kind of passed over from the Nazis to the CIA in terms of how they were used and manipulated, or how they figured into both parties' campaigns to roll back communism.
Yeah. Well, the biggest AMCOM-Lib ran two radio stations, which are well known. One was Radio Free Europe, which broadcast into the Eastern Europe, and one was Radio Liberty, which broadcast into the Soviet Union. And they broadcast in all the different languages of the Soviet Union. So they had people, they didn't just have Muslims working for them, they had Georgians, Ukrainians, of course Russians, and also many Muslims. But the other thing that that AMCOM-Lib did was run covert propaganda operations. So they would actual sort of operations in countries, not just broadcasting into countries, but sending people in, like to Saudi Arabia during the Hajj season.
To do what?
Well, the Soviets were sending Soviet Muslims on the pilgrimage, and they would go and spread the word of communism and say, these newly independent countries, many of them were Muslim, many of them were sending people, of course, on the pilgrimages. and to try to get the word out on how great the Soviet Union was, that mosques were being reopened and it was a more equitable society, etc. So the U.S. sent in these Munich Muslims to, in some cases, shout down the people. One guy in his report said he threw tomatoes on the stage when the Soviet Muslims were trying to talk, and they claimed that they prevented a meeting with King Saud at the time. So some of it was pretty, just crude stuff, or slapping handbills up on the wall, listing all the problems. Other times I went to like the Bandung conference, which gave birth to the non-aligned movement, and participated as ex-Soviet Muslims who were trying to influence that conference to get the newly non-aligned countries away from the Soviet Union.
Besides throwing tomatoes, were there any incidents where the CIA's planted Hajj goers sort of met face to face with this? I mean, were you able to get the sense that they were able to notice and know exactly who each other were at the Hajj?
Oh, they knew who each other were. Yeah, they knew who they were. And I have, this book doesn't have pictures, but on my website I have pictures which you can look at if you want, of people dressed up, of CIA agents dressed up in Saudi garb, going to the Hajj, and they confronted each other. The weakness that these ex-Soviet Muslims had is that they had participated in World War II for the Nazis. So the Soviets discredited them, and in Izvestia and other newspapers there were articles saying these are just ex-Nazis. Why is anybody listening to them? And so this was a problem for the CIA going forward in the 1950s.
And so how long did the CIA kind of have managerial control over this project before it began to slip out of their hands and come under the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood?
I'm not sure that they had direct managerial control over the creation of the mosque, but they were involved in it up until the early 60s when Bob Dreyer, the agent, was sent to Saigon to head up covert, well, not head up, but to participate in covert propaganda in Vietnam. And I think that was symbolic of the overall shift of U.S. priority to Vietnam at that time. And my overall sense is that they just lost track of this from the early 60s until about the late 70s with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And then Islam was kind of back on everyone's radar screen.
I want to come back to the overall story, but as a quick, I mean, when we say the word covert, it automatically carries a little bit of a nefarious
spy versus spy
undertone, exactly. And so, but covert propaganda campaigns, I mean, it seems to me like that's what the CIA should have been doing against the Soviet Union. I mean, it seems like it's a relatively harmless enterprise. Do you agree, or do you see that it?
Well, yeah, it's hard to know. I think what happened with Radio Liberty, for example, and Radio Free Europe, is they were ultimately harmed by the CIA ties. When it came out, it became public in about 1971 in hearings in the Senate, and created a sort of scandal, and then later they were taken over by the State Department. It became more clearly delineated what they were supposed to be doing. Yeah, some covert propaganda is probably okay. I mean, I'm not really an expert on or a public policy wonk on, what the intelligence agency should or shouldn't be doing. But I think it created, part of it was also aimed domestically at U.S. audiences. For example, some of these cases in the Hajj where they threw tomatoes and so on, some of it was reported in the New York Times and Time magazine, and it was portrayed as spontaneous uprising by Soviet Muslims against, what they saw as the terrible Soviet Union. It was complete BS. It was a CIA operation. So it gave this impression to American audiences that there was some kind of a popular uprising or popular anger when it wasn't really the case.
Right.
So, and you can find this in the New York Times website. A couple of the particular cases from about 1955.
One of right around that same period, I believe, is when President Eisenhower had a very interesting visitor. And,
Yeah.
and could you talk a little bit about that and kind of how, what the symbolism of Sayyid Ramadan's visit was and when that was?
Yeah, so as the 50s go forward, the CIA is looking for other Muslims that can tell the story better, the anti-communist story, and they
Better
quickly,
than the
better than
former Central Asian emigres who,
who are, say, tainted by the Nazi past. Plus, most of them didn't have a high educational level. Sayyid Ramadan was the son-in-law of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. He married Hassan al-Banna, one of Hassan al-Banna's daughters, and he was sort of called the foreign minister of the Muslim Brotherhood, traveled widely, spoke fluent English, was a trained lawyer, and in 1953, Princeton University held a colloquium that seemed to be just a pure academic conference. They invited Muslims from around the world. The thing was actually sponsored by USIA and other government agencies that wanted to bring Muslims to the United States to show them the spiritual vigor, the freedom of religion in the United States. And Sayyid Ramadan was one of the people invited.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole back and forth in the Eisenhower White House about whether to invite him or not and how to invite him, whether it would be a good idea. His biography was, he was sort of pushed by the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, and they sanitized his biography. They made him, they didn't mention some of the more dubious or violent activities that he'd been associated with.
Such as?
Well, he participated in, he had close ties with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He had participated in the 1948 war, the creation of Israel. And although all of these maybe have been to some degree perfectly legitimate, he wasn't exactly just the pure freedom-loving guy that he was shown to be.
And his son, obviously, is a source of great controversy today.
Yeah, indeed, he's the father of Tariq Ramadan. But I think really in the history of political Islam, Sayyid Ramadan is really more important. He was extensively involved in Pakistan with Islamist organizations there. At various times carried a Pakistani or a Jordanian or a Saudi Arabian passport. And for many years, while he was based in Switzerland, he edited an influential magazine called Al-Muslimun.
Mm. So talk a little bit about how you found out that his meeting with President Eisenhower.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time, well, not a lot of time, but a fair amount of time in the Eisenhower presidential archives in Kansas. And there was quite a lot of back and forth about how to use religion to fight communism. And they came up with all kinds of funny ideas.
Such as nudists.
Well, use nudists. That was the original idea. No, they didn't. For one thing, I think it was about 1954, there was problems with during the Hajj season. The pilgrims couldn't make it to Mecca. Many of them were stranded. And so one guy, I think in the National Security Council, came up with the idea, why don't we do a Berlin airlift in Saudi Arabia and airlift people to Mecca? And this was quickly shot down. He said, no, we better not do that because this is the infidels will be in the places, the holy places of Islam. This will be a disaster for us, actually. And somebody else Eisenhower brought up the idea that he'd heard of the term jihad, holy war, and wasn't this a term that we could use to fight the Soviet Union? And somebody else shot that down and said, no, well, everyone right now is really ticked off at Israel, and the only person they want to probably have a jihad against is Israel, so we better not encourage that idea right now. But you can see they were sort of playing around and thinking of ways to use religion.
And you sort of opened up his guest book one day, and there was Sayyid Ramadan's name there, which confirmed to you that, or showed you that there had obviously been he'd obviously been a meeting, and that he was courting these kinds of these somewhat controversial Islamic leaders.
Yeah, I mean, there was a huge paper trail about the meeting, back and forth memos, what this conference was supposed to achieve, how to even pay for people like Sayyid Ramadan, because the State Department had some money to invite the people. It was supposed to be a cultural meeting. Ramadan didn't qualify as a cultural figure, so they ended up asking Aramco, the oil company, to pony up some money to pay for his trip over to the United States. So if you're a fan of conspiracy theories and how big oil's behind everything, you can probably find some fodder there.
Could you talk a little bit about the process of reporting this book through old Nazi records, old CIA records, whether it was difficult, whether people were forthcoming, how sensitive this still is when it comes to sort of America's national security archives, et cetera?
I found a lot of stuff in Germany and Switzerland, and a lot of personal archives that people opened up to me. A lot of people felt that they had participated in historic events and had kept a lot of papers. So I was able to get a lot of information from people. One of the most fun things that I discovered is when I met Bob Dreher's old friend, Karen West, in a nursing home in Munich. She had worked for Radio Liberty, and at his farewell party, she had taped the whole farewell party on a reel-to-reel cassette, and people had sung a song to Bob Dreher about how he hung out with people and nudists and all this sort of stuff, and she'd then taped this whole thing and then put it on a cassette and said, "You want to hear the farewell party?" And I'm like, oh, wow. You know? So there you are, sort of transported back to sort of Mad Men period of U.S. foreign policy. So that was a lot of fun. There was no access from the CIA. The CIA rejected FOIA after FOIA on national security grounds. But there were actually a lot of CIA documents that showed up in archives of CIA front organizations like AmComLib, and people's personal papers and a few other archives as well.
What do you think is the most? What do you think is the sore spot, the sensitive point for the CIA in not wanting to discuss these sorts of documents? I mean, is there?
Well, we're still dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood today. I think that's probably it, and I think that it would be embarrassing or compromising to show the earlier dealings with the Brotherhood. It could be embarrassing for the Brotherhood. I think it would be embarrassing for the Brotherhood also, but also perhaps for the CIA. So,
well, let's use that as a pivot to kind of bring us up to the mosque from, say, 70, when the Muslim Brotherhood really began exerting its influence inside it up till today. Kind of what's the evolution, what's the genesis of the players inside the mosque up from then until today?
So what happened was Sayyid Ramadan helped bring the Brotherhood and political Islam into the mosque. They took over the mosque project. Ramadan himself became alienated from the Brotherhood's leadership. The Brotherhood increasingly was relying on Saudi Arabia for funding, especially it was banned in Egypt. Many of the leading brothers who could escape went to Saudi Arabia. Ramadan was fiercely independent and an idealist. He used to sign his letters from the country of Islamistan, and so he, really believed in this ideal. And he couldn't stand Saudi control over his Islamic Center in Geneva or over his magazine, and so he was eventually pushed out of the project. And just around that time, the project, though, really took off. The mosque became a center of political Islam. The board of directors was like a who's who of political Islam, from people from South Asia, from Jamiat Islamiyah, in the Middle East and Europe, and played that role up until about 10 years ago.
And you suggest in the book that there's a 9/11 connection as well.
Not a direct connection. There's the three pilots that I mentioned at the beginning who were radicalized were not radicalized in Munich, but there were people, the guy often called Al-Qaeda's financial chief or bin Laden's mentor, Salim, he was arrested in 1998 while visiting people close to the mosque. He was arrested right in the suburb near the mosque. And there was a big investigation that went on at that time. It took them up to Hamburg, to the Al-Quds Mosque, where the pilots had been radicalized, but the connection was never really made. And the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, the person who was charged with that, he he had just visited Germany before going to the U.S.
This is the blind sheikh?
No, Abu Halima.
Okay, okay.
He had sought spiritual counseling from the chief imam at the mosque, who said, well, I could give spiritual counseling to anybody, blah, 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 blah. But there certainly are these sort of places where there's connections or...
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have questions? Anyone? The Muslim Brotherhood itself. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood chapters go by different names all across the world. I mean, Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan, the Islamic Renaissance Party in Tajikistan. I mean, so you've got sort of different variations of this basic Muslim Brotherhood ideology. What do you see as being the goals and the objectives of the Muslim Brotherhood itself? I mean, we talk about, the book is very much that the Muslim Brotherhood is behind this mosque, but are they something... I mean, they dress like you and I, no ties, suits. I mean, are they something to be feared, or are they?
Yeah, I think
how do they fit into the picture.
I think the wrong way to look at it is probably how we looked at it after 9/11. I think there was an immediate effort to criminalize the Muslim Brotherhood and to say, there's a link to terrorism. And almost 9/11 was, in some ways, maybe the best thing that happened to the Brotherhood, because in many cases, there were no direct links to terrorism. And there was this feeling that, well, if you're not Al-Qaeda and you're not blowing up a building, then you're okay.
Mm.
And I think the problem with the Brotherhood isn't that, although it does have some links to terrorism, you can say Hamas grew out of the Brotherhood, it certainly still has a very anti-Semitic ideology, and people who are considered to be spiritual leaders of the Brotherhood movement have condoned suicide bombings. Mm. But the bigger problem to me is that it creates the mentality that leads to terrorism, the us versus them, the bifurcated worldview. That's the first step. It doesn't mean that everybody who's in the Brotherhood or who comes into contact with Brotherhood ideology becomes a terrorist. Of course, a lot of it, to become a terrorist, I think there's also a big personal biographical component of why the switch is flipped in someone's head and not in someone else's head. Mm. But I think the ideology of the Brotherhood facilitates that and helps lead to that.
I mean, would you go? I mean, people talk about ostensibly non-violent groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir being gateway drugs, if you will. I mean, would you put the Muslim Brotherhood on that scale?
Yeah, I think it's a similar role. Yeah, and again, it's not like everybody at all who's in a Muslim Brotherhood mosque is violent or a potential terrorist. That would be, I think, the wrong way to look at it. Mm. I just don't think it's a good message. Also, if you look at it from the perspective of, say, young Muslims in Germany, which I know better, if you're in this mosque and all this stuff is being sold, all the books by Sayyid Ramadan or Sayyid Qutb, essentially it's saying these books are okay, right? They have the imprimatur. They're being sold at the mosque. It must be okay to follow this path. Mm. And I think that's not a good message to give people.
I mean, I think that one of the things about the Muslim Brotherhood that I've always found difficult is that the organization is set up in a way that's very familiar to a Western perspective. They're very clear. The rhetoric is just very clearly articulated. There's no sort of ambiguity. There may be various layers of it that we as Western journalists see in conversations for sure, but it's so systematic that there's something refreshing about it when you're dealing in Pakistan or whatever. And so I think that it's always been a bit of a difficult thing because, like I said, many of them speak English, and so they're the ones who get on the phone and can talk to you about the day's events. Mm-hmm. And so I think that. But do you think that this PR strategy is a reflection of the fact that the Brotherhood come from a more educated layer of society, or is it part of the Brotherhood's overall program and platform?
I think it's very much that they come from a better educated strata of society. Yeah, I think this is what makes them seem to be ideal interlocutors for politicians in the West also. When you're looking to talk to, if you're a politician, say in France or Germany or the UK, and you want to talk to Muslims, then it's a lot easier to talk to somebody from the Brotherhood than to be talking to some shopkeeper or factory worker who maybe doesn't even speak that good English or German or French, and doesn't have the same sort of doesn't speak in the same vocabulary that you speak.
Right.
So.
Right. Is there a question in the back, sir?
Yeah, thanks. My name is Ken Dante. Just a basic question. Go back to the beginning of the story. There was a mixture where it comes in contact with Nazi ideology. And if you were to look at the child of those two beliefs, and you have Islam, which I don't want to denigrate, but you also have National Socialism. How did those two genetics mix? What kind of brew was created in that specific culture? I realize that they don't mix everywhere, but in that particular culture.
Well, you know, I do not think that the book does not argue that the Muslim Brotherhood was created by Nazis or anything like that. I think that there were people who we'd consider to be high up in the Muslim Brotherhood, like or part of that ideological universe, like the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who clearly collaborated with the Nazis. Many of the propagandists, the Muslim propagandists who worked for von Mende, regurgitated, at least you could say they regurgitated Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. Because most of them, or pretty much all of them, are dead, it's hard to know motives or whether they believed it. The few that I did talk to said, oh, we were just repeating what was in the Nazi newspapers. And that could be the case. But clearly, on some level, they were able to work pretty well with the Nazis. And the Nazis had no problems working with them, unlike with other minorities.
Any other questions? Getting back to engaging, you know, Obama's first speech to the Muslim world was in Cairo, which is obviously the birthplace of the Muslim Brotherhood. What did you, looking at the Cairo speech, what do you think about the Obama administration's policy of engagement?
Well, I think it's, you know, I think the speech on some levels was great, and I think we should be reaching out to all parts of the world. However, the engagement strategy actually that we're following now is pretty much the same as that of the second Bush administration. Starting in so I said they tried to criminalize the Muslim Brotherhood right after 9/11, but by about 2005, the Bush administration was explicitly courting political Islam again, and I discussed this a little bit in the book. And there's some State Department and CIA analyses about that. And I think the Obama administration has just been continuing that. Talking, and again, you have to be careful because you do want to be able to talk with anybody if you're a government. You talk with the rulers of North Korea, why can't you talk with the Muslim Brotherhood? So for foreign policy, I think that's fine. I think it's a problem, especially in Western countries, when political Islamic groups are held up as the norm-setting organizations in those countries, and that's kind of what we've been doing
where we give the Muslim Brotherhood an equal voice in domestic political debates as to mainstream.
Yeah, or even hold them up as moderates and hold them up. For example, there was a conference in 2007 in Brussels that was sponsored by the State Department, where we brought together essentially Muslim Brotherhood people from the United States and Muslim Brotherhood people from Europe and put them together in a room. I think it's almost crazy in a way. I mean, what is the point of meetings like that? And the stated goal was we're going to create a network of moderate Muslims. But it just doesn't seem like that's the right way.
Do you have a question? One of the comments, I believe it was Adam Hochschild, uses the word blowback, I believe. And blowback is so often associated with, I mean, when we think about blowback, the quintessential example, of course, is, you know, CIA support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s. And obviously it had negative consequences. Do you see the CIA's initial support for the Mosque in Munich project as having definitive negative consequences?
Well, it didn't directly lead to Al Qaeda, let's say. I think it's part of this half-century long effort to instrumentalize Islam, and I think we're always complaining that Islam is politicized, and we wish Islam were maybe less politicized, etc. But when we reach out to the Muslim world, we're often reaching out to the most political elements of that world. And so I think that we shouldn't be surprised that it is politicized. And I think we do in that way contribute to it.
I mean, right now, sure, go ahead. Sorry.
Do you think you mentioned the Brussels conference, do you think there's a widespread agreement at the State Department that these folks are Brotherhood? Is that, are we going to accept that, they accept that as a truth? And second, there is a lot of controversy over whether Tariq Ramadan is Brotherhood or not, and he adamantly denies it. So what do you think the CIA or State Department's perspective is on Tariq?
Can you identify yourself in your organization?
Oh, sorry. Hedi Amiramati, president of Word.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I think on the Brussels meeting, for example, well, they did say that there are many people who are participating who might be considered extremists in internal State Department cables. So I don't know how they exactly view it, but they must have viewed that there was some problematic people in the meetings. On Tariq Ramadan, I think he gets, to some degree, a bum rap, because I think just because his father was in the Muslim Brotherhood, and his grandfather was the founder, etc., I don't think that really means anything, right? It doesn't prove anything to me that he's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. He is an advocate of some kind of political Islam. I think he's almost overrated. I don't think he should have been banned from the United States. I don't see why. If you disagree with him, he's not advocating any sort of violence, and you just let him in and debate him, put him on a podium and with someone else and have a discussion. I think his ideas, frankly, to me, they're not that profound. I think he's almost a creation of the media. He's a very clever operator in that sense. He's more of a phenomena. Like, why? To me, the interesting is, why is he so popular in Western Europe? And that's more the interesting aspect too.
Of course, Tariq Ramadan was just allowed back in the States, I think, what, 2.5, 3 weeks ago, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And he, how much between his ideas, how much daylight is there, though, between his ideas and between central Muslim Brotherhood ideas?
I think it was closer in the past. He wrote the foreword for a book, a collection of fatwas put together by a council that is pretty close to the Brotherhood, has Yusuf Qaradawi as the head of it. Later, he's publicly distanced himself from the Brotherhood. He's criticized the Brotherhood in some ways, and Yusuf Qaradawi. So I don't know, the exact amount of overlap. I think in some ways he wants to have it both ways. I think he wants to say, okay, I'm for multiculturalism, blah, 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 but his vision of Islam is in some ways quite traditional.
Do you have a question, man?
Yeah, I'm Gail Sluderman, visitor, but I didn't understand the Hochschild blowback and the tie-in.
So what I was at, my question was just that the word that's used here is blowback, and so the question is, if blowback is the adjective that's used to describe this book and the CIA's support for this mosque, then is our support for that mosque, or is the CIA's support for that mosque necessarily a negative thing, or has it borne out negative consequences?
Yeah, and I would say it has, but not as, say, dramatically as the blowback story from Afghanistan that created or helped lead to Al Qaeda, where you have a very clear, linear development or some sort of links like that. I think it's more, this is perhaps more on the deep structure of how the U.S. views Islam.
Mm-hmm. Did you, in the process of reporting this book, you mentioned it was an audio tape or it was a videotape? It was videotapes from the party, right?
Audio.
Audio. Okay. So did you have any other goldmine sources that that without whose support this book wouldn't be where it is, that were kind of that opened up personal archives that really took the book to the next level?
Von Mende's personal papers.
Mm.
His name isn't that common in Germany. So I knew there was a professor von Mende at a university in Berlin, and I thought, oh, I wonder if he's related. So I called him up, and he said, "Oh, that was my papi," and I said, "Oh, so he passed away. I knew he'd passed away already." And he said, "But I have his personal papers if you want to look at them." And he had, back then everybody often wrote letters, the front of the letter, then carbon copies right behind it, and he had all the carbon copies of all the sort of intelligence operations and his first encounter with Syed Ramadan, and he had a little card. Back then people would keep card files on people, right? So he had the Syed Ramadan's first card file. He said Syed Ramadan, something like Syed Ramadan, comma 36, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. R for Ramadan. R drives a Cadillac, a gift of the Saudi government.
Interesting.
I don't, who knows if that's accurate or not, but you have to also be careful when you're looking in the archives. The Swiss archives, for example, say very definitively Syed Ramadan is a U.S. agent. But you have to ask yourself, does that the analyst for that Swiss agency know what he's talking about when he writes that? What are his sources?
Right.
Is it just he assumes he is, or he's acting like one, or is he just being provocative in that memo that he's writing? Or maybe he's talking to the CIA and the CIA tells him that. I mean, it could run the whole gamut, so you have to be somewhat careful in this.
What was the most surprising revelation that you had over the course of reporting?
The most surprising revelation, I think probably the most surprising thing was the Eisenhower use of religion, that they'd, right at the beginning of the administration, they drew up this memo, the religious factor, and were very clearly looking at religion. And it wasn't just Islam. Of course, that's what interested me, but they had a long paper also on the use of Buddhism because of Vietnam and the rising importance of Southeast Asia in their thinking. So they were looking at how Buddhism could be used for foreign policy goals.
Sure.
On this invitation. My name's Mike Oldhausen. On the invitation, there's a couple of paragraphs. The first one begins in the wake of the news. The second one begins culled from an array of sources. Did you write those, Mr. Schmidl, or did Mr. Johnson write those paragraphs?
I didn't write them.
Well, I mean, they are pertinent because they are the ones that lead people to have an interest in the event.
You have a question?
Well, yeah, I'm getting to that. There's some wording in here which I was curious about. West German and U.S. intelligence agents were told became active as that war, meaning the Second World War, and the Cold War began. Well, Second World War, we know when that ends. That's 1945, and the Cold War is certainly well underway by the Berlin blockade. So by 1948 or so, you've got apparently West German intelligence agents. I'd like to hear something more about who the West German intelligence agents were who were working at. Germany was an occupied country. It had very little ability to field agents.
Sure.
Two other points. Radical Islam's first beachhead in the West. That's the end of the first paragraph. And then there's another phrase at the sort of toward the end of the second paragraph. The West's first disastrous encounter with radical Islam. So we have radical Islam appearing twice. Pretty sinister stuff. It's the first beachhead. They're encroaching. They're coming. And I would like to know how this got to be constructed, this language, and perhaps something more about those West German agents.
Sure. Well, I guess Ian could probably talk about the West German agents, and you could ask our events coordinator about the wording of the invitation.
Well, you're right. West Germany was founded in 1949, so the sentence is incorrect. We stand corrected that it was. I think, though, it's written. I don't know exactly who wrote that. I don't think I wrote it, but
I don't think I didn't write it.
Just to look at it generally as an era, as one war is ending, another war is beginning. But you would be, yeah, you're right. So we'll take that point. And
The beachhead, radical beachhead.
well, I think it is the first base in the West for the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that's easier. That's pretty easy to defend. The former head of the Muslim Brotherhood, who just resigned last year, Mahdi Akef, when he was in exile, he was the head of the Islamic Center of Munich in the 1980s. So it was important, and you can see from the board of directors, a whole slew of people were involved in running that mosque for about 30 years who were crucial in political Islam.
When did it start? There are no dates on this. This really begins when?
The mosque? Well, the project was conceived of, the first meeting of the Mosque Construction Commission was in 1958.
And it was operational. I mean, people were praying in there as when?
Later. The mosque had a long and tortured history of, the construction history took a long time. They ran out of money for a while, and first the Kingdom of Libya promised money, and then eventually, after the revolution there, Gaddafi stepped in and honored the previous commitment of money, and it only opened up in 1973.
Mm. And what is the Friday Jumu'ah congregation size now, approximately? Do you have any idea?
It's big, but it's now a much more normal functioning mosque for ordinary people who happen to be in the neighborhood at the time. And you'll have 500-600 people showing up. There are tents, often tents outside during large prayer days. But initially, for years, it wasn't like that. And there's a very interesting a very interesting exchange in the early 1970s where the board of directors of the mosque has been asked by Turkish guest workers if they could join. The Turks are now immigrating to Germany, and they wanted to join the mosque and join the board. And many of them were going there to pray. And the board was like, no, we can't allow Turks of all people to join in the management. And it was seen as that this had to be a really small group. It was not really meant to be open to outsiders. And it was only later that changed. But for years it was run almost as a small cell or a small organization.
And mostly the ethnic makeup of that cell at the time was mostly?
Mostly Arab, and then they allowed some Pakistanis in from Jamaat, and only grudgingly later Turks.
Sure.
You also point to a change that occurred 10 years ago, I guess? Was that the becoming more of a mainstream mosque? Is that the change you refer to 10 years ago?
Yeah, I'd say increasingly in this past decade. The mosque had a bit of a crisis in 2001 when the head of the organization, Khalid Pimat, was designated as a terrorist financier right after 9/11, and his finances were frozen. And he was put on this UN list of terrorist financiers, and he had sole signing authority for all the finances of the mosque. So they had to quickly dump him. And he resigned right after, or a few months after that, and they elected somebody else to run it. And again, I think that was kind of an example of the problem in our approach, because there was really no evidence for this, because I think only now the Obama administration has reversed this, or I don't know if it's been officially announced, or it's been discussed that Himat and his counterpart Yosef Nada, who's maybe a little more famous since both live in Switzerland, that they're going to be taken off this list of terrorist financiers.
What's the relationship between the German government and mosques in Germany today? I mean, how much oversight does the German government have over who is preaching there, or how the mosques are day-to-day activities? Is there any?
The German government has primarily outsourced its religious policy to Ankara, and has signed an agreement with an organization called DITIB, D-I-T-I-B, which is a branch of the religious authority in Turkey, and they send over imams on 5-year visas to serve in the local community, and then they go back. the Germans feel that this guarantees that there will be more secularist imams in mosques. The downside of it is that these people don't have roots in the local community, and they're only there for maybe 5 years. They don't necessarily speak German. They can't talk to the local people very well. The new generation of Turkish Germans don't really speak Turkish anymore, don't speak very good Turkish. So they can't really go to the imam if they have some issue or problem and they want to discuss something. So they're, I think, increasingly estranged from the local community. But this has been kind of the policy. But, yeah.
The ruling party right now in Turkey, the AKP,
Yeah.
is a Muslim Brotherhood extension, one could say, yes?
Well, they have an agenda for politicalism, yeah. So that's perhaps a problem for the German government. I don't know. They haven't really thought this through, perhaps.
Sure.
How are the imams chosen, and has there been any drift or trend over the decades of the imam of the mosque?
Imams at this mosque,
Yes.
they've been chosen by the board of directors. It's been a lot of continuity. There's been one guy who is the chief imam. He's been there for about 20 years. Yeah. So it's been fairly.
And he's a Turk?
Well, he's a German Egyptian. I mean, he's born in Egypt, immigrated to Germany, and has a German passport.
Anyone else? What are other stories, other nudist revelations, or stories that you picked up while reporting this book that you want to share?
Well, nothing about nudists, but I think one of the people that really fascinated me was this guy called Ahmad Kamal, who was an author, a novelist. His books were reviewed in the New York Times and other newspapers like that. One book, and they're all republished on Amazon, sort of a personal, publishing thing, whatever. One of his books, Land Without Laughter, talks about his exploits in Central Asia as a pan-Turkic activist in the 1930s, where he fought against the Chinese with a Muslim warlord and so on. And he ends up on the CIA payroll after going to Indonesia and settling in Spain, and also comes into contact with the whole mosque project. So he's another one of these weird people that I came into contact with.
Yeah. Now, and were you able? Is he still alive?
No, he died about 15 years ago.
How many interview? I mean, you met with a couple with Tariq Ramadan. Did you speak with for this book?
No, he wouldn't agree to interviews.
Really? What was the most contentious interview you had over the course of reporting this?
All the interviews were harmonious and content. No, it wasn't. I don't think they weren't really contentious. I talked to a lot of people, but mostly the information is from archives. Most of the people involved in this are dead. The three main characters are dead. And I thought at times this was a pity, and I found out about Bob Dreyer, and I contacted his family. I went and visited his sister, who was in a retirement home outside of Philadelphia, and she said, he just died a few months ago. And I thought, oh, what a pity. I really wish I could have met him. And then she said, but I have all his personal papers, which I'll hand over to you, and including his application to the CIA and all this stuff. And I thought, I wonder if he would have given me all this stuff. Sure. He admits in his application form that his favorite activities were ping pong and dancing, and that he was least adept at languages and stuff like that. It's really interesting, and get much more of a richer, in some ways, a richer picture of the person. Because as a journalist, you always want to talk to people, and you assume that's the most valuable thing.
Right.
But everybody has the message they want to get out. So.
Definitely.
Did you get a chance to speak to the chief imam?
Yes, I did speak to the chief imam on several occasions, and I've been I've participated in or observed roundtable discussions where he's been active. I've seen him numerous times.
I meant to ask earlier, what is the tone of his Friday sermons? I mean, what's the rhetoric? What's the tone? What's the...
It's fairly neutral. I mean, without implying that it was different before, after 9/11, you'd have to have been really foolish if you were standing up in a mosque this well-known a mosque delivering a radical sermon.
Mm.
I think the really radical, and in Europe anyways, I think the radical preaching is done by people over the internet and that sort of thing. So in a mosque like this, it's not so much the Friday prayers that's the problem. I think it's more what's on sale at the bookstore, what kind of speakers come, the overall sense of what's okay and what's not okay that they give out.
The informal discussions that are happening. And
Well, probably the informal discussions also, yeah.
well, Ian, thanks a bunch. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
Congratulations and best of luck. Ian, by the way, was just on Diane Reeves' show today, so if you want to listen to another hour of Ian when you get home, you can.
Don't do it.
So, thanks a bunch.
All right, thank you.